tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to welcome into the show here Kris Sims. She is the Alberta Director with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and obviously has been covering this extensively. We saw her with my colleague Rachel Emmanuel on True North. Kris, what are your first thoughts on the election results?
Nice to be on here, and it was nice to see you on Monday night, of course, during our big election coverage. We're pretty pleased with the policies that the UCP was promising during the campaign. So to back up a little bit, even before the election, the UCP government passed a law saying that they would have balanced budgets and that they would rein in their spending and tie it to the rate of inflation and population growth. Now, that's a big deal. It sounds kind of dry, but it's a really big deal because that keeps the government from just splurging. If they get a big surplus, if oil is good that year, it keeps their spending in check. It's something that the CTF has been asking for since the 90s. Like the Backstreet Boys were topping the charts when we were last asking for this. So we were super happy to see that. They also agreed to seriously pay down the debt in a big way. So again, this is all law. This wasn't even something they had to campaign on. They're going to put 50% of their surplus down on the debt every year. That's really similar to what the late Premier Ralph Klein did when he put 75% down. That's how he held up that paid in full sign. And so we're really pleased to see the promises that now that they've made during this election, including things like strengthening the Taxpayer Protection Act by saying, hey, you know what? If we want to increase your personal income taxes or business taxes, you need to have a referendum on it first. And the government needs to win it. So there's some pretty serious promises we're seeing. So we're pretty happy with that.
Yeah, let's talk about the referendum aspect because stuff like this I find is useful in some ways, but not in others because governments that want to get around it can get around it. I mean, it's not a constitutional requirement, so theoretically a future government could say, we're just going to change the law requiring the referendum and pass the tax on our own. But I guess my hope would be that it either reflects or creates a culture where governments in Alberta do not look at the taxpayers as ATMs.
Exactly. And I think especially in Alberta. Now, I'm a transplant. Our family moved out here in the summer from British Columbia. And I will say one of the biggest differences I've noticed here in Alberta is the grassroots activism and how engaged people are. I mean, you can send out an email with a heads up of like a few days saying, hey, come to this pub in Red Deer if you want to hear about balanced budget legislation, like the cost of just transition. And 200 people will show up. Like, it's really remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. And apparently it's just par for the course here in Alberta. And what's interesting is that right now, the Taxpayer Protection Act in Alberta is the reason why we have no PST. It's currently the only element of the Taxpayer Protection Act. It is that you will have to win, government, a referendum before you put in a sales tax. Good luck with that. So that's why we have no PST. So we're hopeful that it'll have that same level of sharp teeth when they expand it.
Well, and just on that note of direct democracy here and of citizen engagement, the Kenney government also passed, I think it was Bill 52, if I'm not mistaken, which allowed for recall of politicians. And I think even of specific bills, if I'm not mistaken. So again, you know, there's another level of democracy. If a politician goes against their word, goes against their promise, there's a very high bar, but there is a bar nonetheless that groups of people that get together in Red Deer and across the province can say, no, we are recalling you because you have failed to uphold your mandate to us as an MLA.
That's right. And before that, the only jurisdiction in Canada that had that rule was British Columbia. And it was used almost successfully one time. Basically, the MLA realized he was going to get recalled and then quit. And so it worked well that way. And so Alberta, not to be outdone, did pass that law. But what's really interesting is that they did BC one better. It's extended to city level, too. Mm-hmm. They did it as a two-banger with that law. So now municipal city councils can get recalled as well. It's a really important tool. Like you said, the threshold is high. You know, it's not as if you get a couple of disgruntled people in, you know, Red Deer somewhere that they're going to pull down the whole government. But it's that tool in the toolbox. It's that little tap on the shoulder so that if an MLA or a premier or whatnot, or a city councilor or a mayor starts messing around. Exactly. Or a school trustee starts messing around and getting into hot water, there's that extra oh man, I could lose my job. But there's a flip side too, which I find really interesting and fair. It doesn't just fire them, it holds a by-election. So that, say there were some group that was really mad about whatever reason, and a lot of people perceived it as being unfair. And they fomented this big campaign and they said, let's have a by-election. Hey, if that person's voters in that riding says, you know what? Bob did a good job. We still like Bob. He can keep his job. He just needs to win the by-election. And that's happened in the States in a couple instances. So it's a really interesting tool.
Yeah, that is actually an interesting point, and I think it's actually quite a valid one. I mean, there have been arguments in favor of anyone who crosses the floor should have to be reelected under that party's banner. And again, I mean, whether there's a legal mechanism that should do that or not is something that other people can decide. But I don't think there should ever be a case where MLAs lose sight of what they're there to do. And I feel oftentimes, especially in minority governments where you don't have like the sword of Damocles over your head, there can be a very easy way for an MLA to get there. They've got a 4-year blank check. They know that voters aren't going to start paying attention for maybe another 3 years, so they can do what they want. And certainly at the federal level, we've seen that. I mean, what's happened when we've given the government the credit card without a spending limit?
Yeah, exactly. It's that you've probably seen that cartoon where the couple is standing there and Justin Trudeau is running around flinging money everywhere. And one of them's happy, and then the wife is telling the husband, he's got your wallet. Because he's flinging it everywhere. Well,
yeah, I got my climate action incentive a few weeks back too, and I was like, "Oh, money!" I was like, "Wait! I already paid them. This is my money."
Exactly, it's your money that having been washed through levels of bureaucracy. Thank you very much for your donation. But here in Alberta, we have those swords built in now at every level of government. And so we're really happy about it. And, you know, the reason why we're happy about it is because the Taxpayers Federation, we're grassroots. You know, we take, non-refundable, non-receivable donations. We don't take money from taxpayers. You know, we have thousands of supporters across the country. Most of them are, small town farmers, those sort of folks. And they often will email us with things like, I want lower taxes. I'm worried about my neighbors because they're using a food bank. Like, really direct stuff. And so to see this kind of direct democracy and these tools being put in the hands of the people of Alberta, it's just a very good thing.
I know conservatives, some conservatives, and I use that with the capital C here, not the lower C, have come to fear the CTF because the CTF is unafraid to call out when so-called conservative politicians go against their pledges. Aaron O'Toole comes to mind, running as the big true blue conservative, and then all of a sudden finds some weird like air miles carbon tax hybrid to run on in 2021. I know you, like anyone else in media, has come across Danielle Smith in many, many avenues over the last several years when she was in media, when she was a business advocate. As Premier, has she been receptive to the issues that CTF has tried to put forward?
Very much so. So like you, yes, of course, we've interacted with Danielle personally over the many,
I think
many
actually
years.
You were there when Danielle and I were like concocting plans for world domination at Red Lobster or something.
I was sitting right there at the table. I happen to remember that conversation, and here she is. Premier, can I just take my CTF hat off for just a second?
Yeah.
And just as like a human being, it's pretty remarkable, like this political comeback. She was, all that stuff that happened with Wild Rose, the floor crossing. She lost her seat during that time. And now here we are 1 year from when I think you and I were talking about this. And she's elected to a majority as Premier. It's a pretty remarkable comeback. And I would say the same thing if she were wearing like a red or orange jersey, just objectively speaking. It's a pretty remarkable comeback politically here in Canada. And so to put the CTF hat back on, yes, she has been very receptive. Interestingly, one of the first things we did is we asked all of the UCP leadership candidates to sign our pledge, promising, if I'm Premier, never ever a PST. Not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And she signed it right away. And what's interesting is during the signing, and I hadn't mentioned this to her at all, it was just her kind of nerding out, as she would put it. She's signing it, and she says, hey, I really liked the paper you guys did like 15 years ago where you said if you put enough money into the Heritage Savings Fund, we could get rid of an income tax. Like, wouldn't that be neat in the future? And I'm just like, Yeah, that would be neat.
Did she write that on the pledge as well? Because that might have been a good appendix to try to bring up with her.
I should have called her on it and said, put a rider on that, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
but yeah, yes, the short answer is yes. And even during the election campaign, they agreed to a lot of things, like opening up the Taxpayer Protection Act. And before that, they agreed to balanced budget legislation, debt repayment, saving money in the Heritage Fund, a lot of the meat and potato things that the CTF has been asking for. There's one little thing, if we could push it, for one more thing we would really like to see put in the Taxpayer Protection Act, and that's the carbon tax. So it's going to sound weird, but of course right now there's just a federal carbon tax. What happens if that gets scrapped? What prevents whatever provincial politician is here in Alberta from creating a provincial one here again? It was awful when Premier Rachel Notley had sprung one on Albertans, but they got their say-so on that. Now we're forced to pay Justin Trudeau's mandatory minimum carbon tax, and people here really don't like it. And so we would like one more change to the Taxpayer Protection Act, and that is to put a provincial carbon tax shield in there.
Yeah, that would be, I think, a very, very good one. And if I have the chance to sit down with the Premier in the coming months, I'd like to ask that. So do remind me if you get wind that she's coming on the show.
I will.
Before I let you go, Kris, I want to ask you about that Ralph Klein paid in full, because I think that it's very difficult to unwind government, which is why putting a PST in place, for example, would become permanent. I just know it. I know that it's going to become very easy for a government to look at the numbers when something like that was in, if it were ever in, and say, to roll this back would just be too costly. Is it possible to get back to that paid in full, or has debt just become such an accepted part of doing business now as government that there's no real appetite to make those tough calls anymore?
That's a great question. And again, I would say the same thing if the numbers were there for an NDP or a Liberal government. But here in Alberta, the debt clock is going backwards. Like I've never seen it happen before. So rewind about 6 or 8 months or so ago, the government at the time, before the election, put down the biggest one-time payment on the debt. So they got a surplus, they had some savings, they had some money to actually use. And instead of just blowing it, now I'm sure they wasted money on the margins here and there that we haven't found yet, but they put a big chunk down on the debt. And so now the debt, again, it's an astronomical number. It's around $73 billion, but it's going down. They're reducing the debt. And they already passed legislation saying 50% of the cash surplus must now go down on the debt, or they'll penalize themselves, or, we're allowed to chase them around in a fibber costume, or I can bicycle lock my neck to their leg. Like, we will make them keep their promises. And so here, debt is on the radar. I don't think that's quite broken through at the federal level yet. Like the folks in the parliamentary press gallery aren't really paying attention to that yet. But I'll tell you, when that debt servicing cost, also known as your interest payment on the federal debt, eclipses line items like national defense or healthcare or something like that, they'll start paying attention then.
Do you guys have, you lived in Ontario previously, I know, so you may know this. Do you guys have an Alberta equivalent of the Ontario Opportunities Fund, which is this stupid thing in Ontario where you can voluntarily donate your tax refund to pay down the provincial debt?
Oh!
Which is Mike Harris did it, and apparently it gets $40,000 a year or something. But I'm but in Alberta, I might actually trust that the government would be responsible with that. In Ontario, I don't. I was never going to give Kathleen Wynne my tax refund or anything.
Here's a bag with no hole on the end of it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, promise. But probably.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, anyone can make a donation. They would just have to contact the Treasury Board.
Yeah.
It's for real. Find out their direct deposit or their mailing address and give money to them. In fact,
I don't recommend that ever.
No, I'm not.
But it's I really believe in Alberta, and I want Alberta to be able to do that again, because it sets the standard for every other province in the country that you don't get to just run your government and run your affairs on debt and pretend that that's the only way of doing things.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an example I actually give to a lot of folks when I'll be online or whatever and post something like, "Hey, we've got tax cuts or reductions here." And they're like, "I'm happy paying more taxes." And I'm like, "Well, here's the address of Revenue Canada. Feel free. Take my portion." And so we're very hopeful, but we're also practical. They made a lot of big promises during this campaign. So we're going to have to work really hard on the CTF side of things to hold them accountable for those promises, and we will.
All right, Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Good seeing you Monday. Thanks for popping in today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.